Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Alex. I'm with the Midtown Scholar Bookstore in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and we're delighted to be here virtually with you for this afternoon's program with Josh Cohen and Julian Levinson. First, just a huge thank you to all of our viewers, attendees, customers, and everyone out there who is supporting indie bookstores. The challenges continue as we ramp up for the holiday season, but we're honored to be able to offer programming like this afternoon's event. And with that in mind, it's my honor to introduce our speakers here this afternoon. Our interviewer is Julian Levinson. Julian is the Samuel Schetzer Professor of American Jewish Studies at the University of Michigan. His publications include Exiles on Main Street, Jewish American Writers and American Literary Culture, and articles about topics such as Yiddish modernism, Holocaust representation, and Jewish storytelling. He has translated several works of Yiddish literature, including a novel by Isaiah Spiegel about the Lotz Ghetto. Our featured author this evening is Josh Cohen. Josh is a psychoanalyst in private practice and a professor of modern literary theory at Goldsmith University of London. He is the author of many books and articles on modern literature, cultural theory, and psychoanalysis, including How to Read, Freud, The Private Life, Our Everyday Self in an Age of Intrusion, and Not Working, Why We Have to Stop. He lives in London. Of course, Josh's new book that we are here for this afternoon is titled How to Live, What to Do in Search of Ourselves in Life and Literature. Here it is. I've got to read just one blurb. This one's from LitHub, who writes, quote, Cohen makes the case for fiction as a crucial aid to introspection, suggesting that our ability to see ourselves in literary characters runs parallel to the all-important ability to see ourselves, end quote. Just some quick housekeeping before we get started. If you have a question for Josh, please use the Q&A button towards the bottom of the screen below our faces here. We'd love to hear from you, so ask away at any point, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible towards the end of the program. And most importantly, if you would like to purchase a copy of How to Live, What to Do, once again, here it is, please visit our website, midtownscholar.com, or look in the chat room in just a moment, and I'll provide a link there for you. That is the number one way to support the author, the bookstore, and this event series. Once again, midtownscholar.com. But now, without further ado, Josh Cohen and Julian Levinson.
Thank you, Alex. Nice to be here with everybody. And Josh, it's such a great pleasure to be with you here and to celebrate your beautiful new book. Now, you've written a number of fascinating books on very specific issues. You wrote a book on privacy, the whole concept of the private life. You wrote a book about workaholism and the costs for the psyche, for the psychological life of overworking our focus on work. Now you've written a book called How to Live. What did you set out to do with this book, opening the focus like that?
Thank you. And can I just preface my answer by saying what a pleasure it is to be here. Just one pleasure short of actually being with you in Harrisburg at what sounds like a particularly wonderful bookstore, where I would no doubt while away many hours talking away with you two, because I'm talking to one of my dearest and oldest friends here. So in answer to your question, what am I setting out to do here? I think that the core of the book, the red thread that runs through it, is the concern with imaginative life and the ways in which fiction helps feed our imagination and our capacity to understand ourselves at many different levels. Fiction holds up, according to a very familiar formula, it holds up a mirror to ourselves, but it holds up, I think, an estranging mirror. Not necessarily a funhouse or a distorting mirror, but a mirror that intensifies and magnifies and selects and amplifies different elements and dimensions of our character, our way of being, that we're often not alive to in our everyday way of inhabiting the world. Fiction allows us to see aspects of the self we know, but it also allows us to see the self that we don't know, that's sort of latent in us, that's waiting to emerge, and that we sometimes see with a shock of unexpected recognition in one character or another. And I think that's the value of fiction for me, that it has the capacity to expand and transform our sense of ourselves.
Now, in this book, you take on some of the great classics of the last 200 years. The book is plotted according to the life cycle. You have 8 chapters: play, schooling, rebellion, first love, ambition, marriage, middle age, and then old age and dying. And in each chapter, you bring in 3 to 4 novels to exemplify those stages and to discuss them. You interweave them with case studies from your own practice, which I want to ask you about. But since you just mentioned the power of individual works, I wanted to ask you about the fact that though you talk about writers like Dostoevsky and Virginia Woolf and Henry James, you begin by talking about Peanuts.
Yes.
What was the impact of Peanuts on you?
The impact of Peanuts was pretty profound, which is why I seem to find it very difficult to write a book in which the Peanuts gang do not in some shape or form appear. And usually they appear in the midst of some quite serious disquisition. In the private life, I have a section on Milton and Satan and sexuality, and suddenly Snoopy appears sitting in a veterinary office, complaining that it's embarrassing sitting there with no clothes on. To me, it seemed entirely relevant. But here I sort of talk about Peanuts as an origin story of my own self, partly because I had a child at home who was talking at the time I was writing, talking all the time about origin stories. And it occurred to me that, origin stories shouldn't necessarily be reserved for mythological heroes and superheroes, that perhaps there are ways of finding narratives that explain how we too were brought into being. And how was my own sense of self brought into being? Well, my parents went away on a cruise on the Queen Elizabeth II cruise ship to New York, leaving us with our grandparents, and returned bearing a kind of unimaginable levels of guilt for leaving us behind as young children. I think I was 5 or 6, and gifts to compensate or to buy themselves out of trouble. And what they gave me was a big book of Peanuts cartoons, and I'd sort of seen these guys the strip is syndicated all over the world, so I recognized them, but I never actually sort of delved into the book. And actually I wanted to get away from the reunion scene, so I remember going upstairs to my bedroom and sitting sort of knees up on the bed, opening this book, and there was this cartoon, which was a psychiatric booth cartoon, Charlie Brown and Lucy. And I didn't really understand what they were saying to each other. Actually, the level of discourse for the children that it's aimed at is probably too high, too sophisticated. But I sort of had enough of an inkling. I was able to extract something from it. I knew that what Lucy was telling Charlie Brown is that he had no sense of his own character. Basically, that he had no sense of who he was. This was her sort of harsh, but incisive, surgical psychiatric wisdom. And it hit me like a shot, because I suddenly recognized myself as somebody whose character, as Lucy said, was not very well established, who really kind of lived in this very imitative way, following my brother around, liking the stuff that he liked, using the language that he used, kind of imagining that, he was the authority on what one should desire and what one should be interested in, but not really feeling it from inside. And this was a first experience of saying, okay, so that's me. Paradoxically, I noticed myself in a child who doesn't really notice himself or have any sense of who he is. But it was a start, and it got me into, I think, reading Peanuts as a kind of tacit guide to my own changing emotional states.
Beautiful. I love Peanuts too. And
Yeah.
with
Hard to love anyone who doesn't love Peanuts.
right, but you've written about it so much. Maybe your next book will be about Peanuts.
Yeah.
So you develop these chapters about different stages of life. You look at these different novels, and as I said, you combine literary works with case studies from your own psychoanalytic practice. And it struck me that one of the real main points that you're making, one of the arguments in the book, or let's call it a proposal, is that we cultivate our curiosity about our own life in the same way as if our lives were a novel. In other words, that we think about ourselves in the same way that we think about these novelistic characters. And that's why reading about a character allows you to practice the kind of attention that you might then train on yourself and cultivate a kind of curiosity, fascination with yourself. If I could just read a few moments, you're talking about nurturing a, quote, receptive curiosity and concern for all the contours and textures of life. And then later in the book, you talk about how listening to the unconscious can show us how to live, not by instruction. In other words, not that we are going to get kernels of wisdom to tell us how to traverse one or another hard spot, problem. It's not a book of advice, but by the example of the generous, expansive curiosity it extends to people and things alike. In other words, novels are extend curiosity to people and things in the world. As we read, we practice that act. Do I have that right? Is that
yeah, that's beautifully. It's beautifully sort of concentrated. Yeah.
And we hear a lot about mindfulness these days.
Yes.
Mindfulness practice. Would you consider your approach in this book a kind of mindfulness practice?
It's a really interesting question because I think it comes close to that at many points. It's interested, after all, in inhabiting states of mind attentively. Mm-hmm. That's what listening in psychoanalysis is really about. It's about staying with a state of mind. I think the sort of small but in a way quite decisive difference from mindfulness is I think that mindfulness encourages us to find ways to float above the messiness of the world, to find a space of peace, of idyllic calm that removes us from life's difficulties. And there is undoubtedly a real value to that. But I think what psychoanalysis is doing, and in a way what reading fiction is doing, is something different, because we can be troubled by fiction. We can be upset. In other words, we are right in the mire of the experiential and emotional difficulties of life when we're in fiction. We're in difficult childhoods, we're in painful friendships, we're in sexual betrayal, we're in unhappy marriages, and so on. And those experiences, we're invited not to get caught up in them, but to, in the way that we do in psychotherapy, both to inhabit the experience very closely and to take just sufficient step back from it, to create enough of a gap in our own consciousness that we can also look at it with a spirit of expansive curiosity. So it's close to mindfulness, but it I think is more about inhabiting the kind of life as it is in all its different colors. And there may be people listening who say that is mindfulness, in which case I have no problem.
Inhabiting.
Yeah.
So as I said, there are these case studies which merge with the discussions of characters. I just wanted to pick one, which these are really, in some cases, some of the most confronting, because they're real people. You assume, I guess, that you've made composites or you've blurred the outlines, but
yeah, I say that right. I mean, before the book starts, I say that these are composites, and the idea is that although they're made up of true life elements, they're disguised in such a way that hopefully no one would recognize.
Right.
And certainly thus far, no one has recognized themselves in any of the
and
at
yet,
least so far as I know,
And yet at the same time, we recognize these all too well. I mean, these are very common predicaments. Laura is in her 30s and she's involved with a man, Colin, who she lives with, and it's comfortable, but it's something that she's not sure she can commit to him. You say, no sooner had she resolved to end it than she would tearfully berate herself for her harshness. She had no idea why she was so mean to him. He was so sweet with his goofy smile, always doing little thoughtful things to make her happy, and she needed to get over the idea that being tender was the same as being boring in bed. Really, what kind of monster was she, talking so casually about dumping the nicest man in the world? And so she's stuck. She resolves on one point to expand her horizons and find the man of her dreams, but then she berates herself, and so she's in a kind of a paralysis. So of course, as you read this, you want to know, so what's the answer? What did her therapist tell her to do? How did it work out? What does your book teach Laura?
I hope that the book teach, because there are in a way a few versions of Laura running through the book. You might remember later there's a character called Sunil who is paired really with Gatsby, who also drains away a lot of his life. He's in the middle of middle age now, and he drains away a great deal of his life fantasizing about the woman he lost at the end of college and whom he's never really gotten over. But what's intimated, I think, is that both Laura and Sunil, are actually imaginative arm passes. That is, and this is one of the things I'm trying to say in the book, that one of the richnesses and the paradoxes of the relationship between life and fiction is that fiction, of course, intrudes into, overlaps with real life. But real life is also imagined by us in all kinds of ways. We don't have an immediate, undistorted relationship to any of our friends, our colleagues, our lovers, our families. We are in an imaginative relationship to them. We filter them through the screen of our own needs, our own fantasies, our own hopes, our own anxieties. And that is what both Laura and Sunil are doing. So when Laura oscillates between idealizing this tender little teddy bear and excoriating this sort of ridiculous, hairy sort of goof. What she's doing is finding herself stuck between two particularly impoverished, imagined versions of her lover. There is something that is getting in the way of a more sort of generous, curious relationship, not only to her partner, but actually to herself. In a way, what she was doing, and maybe I don't go into this deeply enough, what she was doing was projecting, I think, sort of unsatisfactory versions of herself. You know, so this man is both loving and sweet and all that you could want, and at the same time, dull, unadventurous. These were anxieties about herself. They may have been true of her partner, but the point is, she's not really able to make contact with her partner in his singularity, only through the kind of stereotype plates that are really her stuff.
They're her stuff. So
Yeah.
Are you saying she should not make a decision and turn inward? Are you saying that she needs to develop a more curiosity about him or about herself? I'm trying to see where I go with my, yeah.
The relational in psychoanalysis for me is always both the relationship to oneself and to others. And that really, whenever we're in one realm or the other, so somebody might be talking about themselves, or they might be talking about their partner or their father, but they're always talking about both. There's always a movement towards the other in the self and a movement towards the self when we're talking about the other. And so Laura, like a lot of people, is stuck in very ossified, dried up narratives about herself. And so if she can be more curious and generous in the way that she looks at herself, if she can surprise herself, then it might be that she's able to make more immediate, more real contact with her partner and discover that actually she loves this man in a deeper and more unsentimental way, or she may discover in an authentic way that they're not right. He is not right for her, that he's not going to sustain a full life and they need to end. But the only way really to make that decision meaningful is to become more interested in herself.
So you're saying when you have a dried up narrative, you confront yourself with two options and they're both stereotypes, and neither choice is going to be an authentic choice.
Exactly.
They're both stereotypes. So if she rejects him, she'll feel guilt and she'll feel regret that she rejected a life of comfort. If she stays with him, she'll feel that she's missing the passion and the joy that awaits her beyond the familiar. But you're saying these are stereotypes. She has to move beyond the dried up narrative. I wonder what novel from the ones you discuss would be the first step towards a more, what's the opposite of a dried up narrative? A liquidified narrative.
Yeah. Kind of, a sort of open, flexible narrative. There are a few. I think the one that really exemplifies it, I mean, it off the top of my head would be the last book in the book, which is Marilyn Robinson's Gilead, which is a book that, you know, many people I know are in love with, have a kind of, you know, ever since it was published, have had a long love affair with that book. And John Ames, the narrator, the the Congregationalist priest in Iowa, in rural Iowa in the 50s, who narrates the novel. And it's the novel is actually a letter to his 10-year-old child who he's had in very late in life. And he's unwell and he's awaiting really his own death, which he feels may be imminent. And he wants to write himself to his son. And you may sort of feel that on paper, John Ames' life couldn't look more desiccated, more imaginatively unpromising. He's never left this poor Midwestern town, really village, that he's grown up in, that generations of his family have lived through. Generations of his family have taken up the priesthood of this little church. And he is a faithful minister to his emotionally needy, impoverished flock. And into his life has come a young, homeless, itinerant woman. And many, many decades his junior, and suggested that he marry her. And he makes this spontaneous decision to do so. And his letter is really the record of his love affair with the world. And he says that consecrating yourself to the sacred is also about sort of nurturing a love affair with worldliness, actually. So that it's a book that can communicate to us what it is to live in proximity to the sacred without needing to have any religious belief. Because proximity to the sacred is really just a kind of unstinting, abundant attention. It's a kind of intense generosity in a perception of people. You know, he writes incredibly lovingly and perceptively about congregants, about his neighbor and best friend, about his 10-year-old son, and of course about his wife, his young wife. So I would say that that's a you know.
Yeah. So that's very clear. Now we have a number of wonderful questions coming in from the chat. So let me move from this to some of the responses from out here. So from Anne, she says, "Is there a contemporary fiction writer working today that sticks out to you as a therapist? One that perhaps writes characters with rich and multifaceted interior lives?" Well, you've just mentioned Marilynne Robinson. What other contemporary fiction writers? Maybe we can link this with a question from Jacob. Was there a character you left out or didn't have editorial room for in the book that you wish you could have included? So contemporary writers who really create that richly textured interior life. Perhaps somebody you had to leave out. Either one of those would be your question, right?
Yeah. I mean, I can try and speak to both of them. I think the first writer that comes to mind in terms of a writer as therapist, which may be counterintuitive, it would be Alice Munro. But I think that in the kinds of terms I'm talking about, in other words, and I think in fact the way that the questioner phrased it, because Anne was not asking, is there a contemporary writer who gives you sort of great therapeutic hacks, life hacks? She's actually saying, is there somebody who allows us to inhabit other characters' emotional lives intimately? And that for me is Alice Munro. I think she takes the most unnoticed and sort of the strangest aspects of interior life and of sort of personal and bodily expression, the way the kinds of facial expressions, the blankness, the sort of mild, almost imperceptible sneers, looks of disappointment. There is something about the human body, the face, the voice that is always so alive for me, that really shows me how to listen and how to get intimate with somebody else's mind. So I think that would be, I didn't have an Alice Munro character on the list, but I did have a number that I wanted to talk about. One of them that sort of ended up on the cutting room floor, so to speak, of the book was in the childhood chapter. I actually wanted to write about Toni Morrison's Beloved. I wanted to write about the character of Beloved, about the fact that she's a ghost, that she is born out of trauma, but of course she is an incredibly disturbing character because she is emotionally and in every other way dangerous and greedy, and that she represents in her whole being a history of trauma. I think what was difficult about incorporating it, and the reason in the end I felt I needed to leave it out, was that the trauma that it describes is so singular. It's not that because Morrison, of course, has a genius for making the absolute outer edges of human experience the worst, including, of course, the killing of one's own child. She has a capacity to render it in a way that is entirely human and that resonates with us and that allows us to imagine it. But it was difficult to incorporate into anything like a recognizable picture of our own lives. So I wanted to stay, in a way, in the end, at a more ordinary level of experience.
So there's a way in which the character of Beloved presented challenges for you that seemed to place, seemed to bring you out of the more general, universal kind of focus. Now, here's another question which kind of relates to that. This is from Aaron. He says, which fictional character did you find the most intriguing to research and perhaps the most difficult? So now we're talking about characters that you did include, but which of those seemed like the most difficult or intriguing to research? That's a great question.
It's a great question. I think the most intriguing to research was Julien Sorel from Stendhal's Rouge et Noir, Red and Black. And I think partly because you have to know something about the historical milieu, the sort of post-Napoleonic sort of wars in France, and the way that Julien's ambitions are caught up in the fortunes of different warring political parties. Now, Julien Sorel is somebody who is consumed by ambition, who has a soul at the beginning of the book, who in a way strives to live a meaningful life, but very quickly confuses it with one of overweening ambition. Or rather, he confuses ambition with private accumulation and status, and loses contact either with a privately meaningful or indeed with any sense of the public good, so that all the moves he makes into the military, into the clergy, are self-serving, manipulative, and betray really a deep narcissism. But we see nonetheless the world, the progress of a life through his eyes. And I think it's intriguing both to research the historical context which can make a character a sort of little monster like this, but also to, again, inhabit the mind of this little monster and inhabit the mind of this little monster and introduce us to a kind of a character that we may find both intolerable and all too recognizable, all too resonant with ourselves. So I found at both the sort of external level of history and the interior level of trying to find myself in this, in so many ways, obnoxious young man. I really found that fascinating.
So here's a question from Eileen. What's the main takeaway you'd like readers to come away with after reading your book?
Yes.
After you tackle that one, I have a rejoinder. I mean, I have another question, which I think sort of echoes Dunbar's. Go ahead. I mean, what would you say here?
I think the title of the book is How to Live, What to Do, and it's basically stolen from the title of a poem by Wallace Stevens. And at the beginning and at the end of the book, I try to suggest that Stevens' poem really concentrates the takeaway of the book. It in a few lines, 3 stanzas, it gives us the sensibility that the book is trying to put across. And it is about listening, but it's also about the lure of the fantasy of the really meaningful, important thing being just ahead of us. What happens in the poem, right? And it's a kind of FOMO fantasy as well. At the beginning of the poem, the character, the speaker describes a man and a companion wandering through a landscape, looking for some spectacle of nature. And whatever they're looking for, they want something that ups the ante a bit. They want a sun of fuller fire.
They had left the flame-freaked sun to seek a sun of fuller fire. So
exactly.
That's allure of fantasy. Yes.
Yes. As if the flame-freaked sun that is there already were not enough for them. No, they want a better sun. And what is, I think, remarkable and poignant but unsentimental about the poem is that they land instead in front of a tufted rock, and they see it with its ridges thrown like giant arms among the clouds. And they realize that this unprepossessing, craggy, rugged mountain, which the wind kind of, meets and creates this choir of noise, really, of unbeautiful and yet real and resonant noise. And this is better, really, Stephen says, than a chorus of angels. That if you can be in front of something and realize that all the riches, all the strangeness, everything that you might want in life may just be sitting there in front of you. And that to renounce what's there in front of you as though it's just a collection of dry facts and chase after the next thing is our most human and most common and, in a way, most unavoidable error.
So thank you. So you mentioned FOMO. And of course, we all suffer from FOMO in increased proportions in the contemporary world when we're inundated with images of other people's lives. And you mentioned that, you talk about digital media and so forth. I wanted to ask you, kind of building on that question, what's the most common pitfall you see in your consulting room? The way I'll phrase it is this. I don't deal with individual psyches in agony and in turmoil. I'm an English professor, and I grade a lot of papers. Very different. But sometimes I give an assignment. And as I'm grading papers, I'll say, you know what? They're all missing one thing. And I can even write a comment and I can cut and paste aspects of the same comment in different papers because they've made the same kind of conceptual mistake. Now, is there a comment that you find yourself saying again and again in the consulting room?
Yeah. I think that the most common predicament is the temptation to reach too quickly for action, to ask the therapist before you've really had a chance to sit with the difficulty, to say, so what should I do? And it's part of the training, I think, to decline to answer that question without sounding rejecting, without sounding like you think it's a stupid question, because it's not a stupid question. It's just a question that tends to lead to the dead end of what you already know. The thing is, you already know the options. You wouldn't be here if you didn't know the options. So if I give you a course of action that simply chooses from the existing options without having thought them through, without having imagined what they mean, all I'm really doing is pressing a button. There's something arbitrary, something kind of abstract about it. There's something abstract about it because it's skimmed off the top of a menu of options. It's not, we haven't had a chance yet to say, well, what does it mean to do this? What is your dilemma? Where does it come from? What are you speaking from when you say, should I marry this person? Should I move abroad? Should I change jobs? Or just something kind of, why am I so unlovable? Why am I so unhappy? What should I do about being so unlovable? Questions like that come up all the time. I think the most frustrating and ultimately, I hope, the most liberating thing about the consulting room is that you're not under pressure to answer that question, that it gives you an hour of relief from that question, which dogs us everywhere else. We always answer the question, what should I do? So that feels to me like the sort of the most common, that it's funny because people have come, of course, for a space of reflection. And yet what they're saying is, I'm stuck in a kind of reflection, but a dry, airless reflection that doesn't get me anywhere. So what I need is a reflection that opens things up, that makes the choice itself look different.
So the posing of questions and then the need to find an answer is one of the common pitfalls. The need to jump into action before somehow doing the work that vivifies the world and vivifies and very beautiful. I have another question here, which is from Sam for both authors. What books inspired you to write and teach literature?
Wow.
Well, we got Snoopy for you, but that's
of course.
the only one, I'm sure.
It's not the only one. It's not the only one. But it's great because what were the books that inspired me to teach literature? I mean, of course, my background, my PhD was in American literature. And I would say that the writers who really first inspired me and made me want to teach were American writers who seemed to be able to bite off such a big chunk of the world, who were sort of almost grandiosely ambitious in and you know, that's what excited me first. So that's somebody who had a kind of appetite for the world. So I think one of the writers that really wanted to make me, that made me want to teach literature was Don DeLillo.
I remember the story you told me that you saw an interview with DeLillo and you hadn't written anything, and you said, "I'm going to write my master's degree about him," and you did. I'll tell anybody out there, if you have any question about Don DeLillo or many, many other things, Josh is your man. The question was addressed to me. I did a thesis on Walt Whitman in college, which took me into new realms also of grandiosity, encompassing the entire world. And I used to, I don't know if I bored my friends over the dinner table, but it was those conversations really while I was writing my thesis about Whitman that opened the door to what a seminar might be. We have only a few minutes. I wanted to end by looking at one interesting moment. We have talked a little bit about frustrations in intimate relationships, quandaries over who the right partner is or should be. And then you have a lot of interesting things to say about marriage and intimate relationships in general. But you say something very striking. Maybe I just wanted to end by reading this and then asking you to elaborate. Maybe you say, this returns us to the paradox of intimacy. In deepening our closeness to another, we not only make them more familiar to us, but also come to sense their strangeness and irreducible difference from us.
Yeah.
Deepening our closeness to another, we not only make them more familiar to us, but also come to sense their strangeness and irreducible difference from us. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, it comes out of a discussion of D.H. Lawrence. And it's actually, I mean, Lawrence is often thought of as a very overblown writer, but actually he's a great writer on the detail of domestic life. And what he's talking about is the misery of everyday bickering between couples. And he describes in a way that anyone who's ever been in a couple will recognize the kind of petty, mean-spirited bickering that couples get into. And the problem he really unfolds for us is that we see only the other that we know, and that we're expecting, and that's become all too familiar. We know all their moves, we know all their plays, and we know our own plays, and we know that they know our plays. And so a kind of contempt builds up because we can't really be surprised anymore. And we feel that we, you know, at its worst, that the relationship becomes a kind of procession of hellish repetition. So how do you get out of that? Well, Lawrence says you have to start recognizing the strangeness of the other person, the fact that actually you don't know them in their fullness, that there's always something about them that you're not going to get to know, that you're not going to intrude into, that you're not going to capture for yourself, that belongs to them. And that, I think, infuses you with a new, I was going to say a new kind of wonder, but it's a very sober kind of wonder. You know, it's not starry-eyed or idealizing. It's a wonder at the fact that there can be another person, that intimacy is possible with somebody who is so close, and yet also, you know, there has to be a chasm between us. There is, and that sort of unknowability of the other, I think, instead of being what we need to overcome, so that, you know, which was also Laura's problem, actually. In a way, she thought she knew this guy all too well, and that what she knew was so familiar and so unsurprising that there was just nothing more to learn, nothing more to discover, nothing more to get excited about. But if you actually make a friend, if you like, of the otherness, the strangeness of your intimate partner, it animates the relationship.
Well, that's very moving and inspiring, and I actually feel a sense of hope thinking about the idea that there will always be this irreducible otherness to another, and maybe to yourself as well, that you will also be the source of surprise for yourself if you cultivate, as you describe so eloquently, this expansive curiosity. I realize that we are now at our end of our 50-minute session. And so we are and here's Alex.
Yeah. I'm going to wrap us up. This was brilliant. Thank you so much, Julian. Thank you so much, Josh, for joining us today. Once again, the book is How to Live, What to Do. Here it is, now available at the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. Go to our website, look at the chat room. I provided a link there for you, or simply head into the bookstore to get your copy. Thank you to our audience members. Thank you for your wonderful questions. And thank you again, Julian and Josh. And I'd just like to kick it back to our authors. If you have a last word, perhaps for our audience out there, Josh.
Well, I want to thank you for such responsive, interesting questions, because this book is all about dialogue. It's all about listening to and being interested in other people's responses. And it felt like they were really participating in the discussion in a very live way. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All I can do is show you the UK version, which you will not get from, but they are the same book. So I feel I'm going to get the American imprint as well, because I like that cover as well. But this is a nice cover too, so you can see. I'm not sure if the contrast between them tells us something about the American psyche versus the English psyche, but I'll leave that for your next book. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, guys. Have a good day.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.